What's going on, guys? TG or ThunderGod here, and today I'm talking about Itachi versus Obito. Interesting matchup, very interesting. I actually found this to be a very interesting topic when doing research about it because I think people make it a little bit more clear cut than it actually is. I think there's a lot of contention with these two individuals, and I think the series itself pretty much sets them up as kind of like pseudo rivals. Like Kishimoto low-key wanted them to be like rivals, but it just never happened. They're just kind of they're two characters who are always talked about in the same sense. So it's definitely something that I find interesting, definitely a topic I want to look at. I kind of want to look at all their forms and really discuss like how I think it would go, why I think that's the case, X, Y, and Z, maybe a little bit of the L in there. I don't know where L came from, but regardless, if you enjoy this video, make sure to like, subscribe if you're new here for more of all that weeb shit. And with that being said, let's get started. So starting off, we're going to be taking sick Itachi in the Akatsuki versus Obito when he's actually in the Akatsuki. Now, the reason I'm not talking about yellow mask Obito or probably red mask Obito is that I'm just going to put them all at the same strength. There is the argument that he could have gotten stronger, but it's completely unquantifiable, and I'd be making some assumptions and assertions on how much stronger I think he got, which isn't fair. So I'm just going to keep them all at the same strength for kind of the sake of this video. So we know Obito was able to combat and rival the Hokage Minato, who's shown to be an extremely impressive fighter and combatant. This would be a fair assessment of the fight, as Minato describes Obito as a greater threat than the Nine Tails itself, and an individual capable of seeing through all of his moves. Even by Minato's own assessment, this is an individual that he told Naruto he would require much more power than he currently had in his Sage mode to combat, essentially. We can also use the 4th Raikage and KCM Naruto as kind of benchmarks, as they're constantly being compared to Jonin or Hokage Minato, depending on your interpretation. The way the scene plays out in terms of the comparison, along with the Raikage's notes of being the fastest shinobi now that Minato is dead, heavily implies that this is Jonin Minato. However, even if you argue it's Hokage Minato, Obito would still be superior to all of these fighters, such as 4th Raikage, KCM1 Naruto, Pain, and many other juggernauts. And we can throw Pain in there because Sage Mode Naruto obviously was able to combat Pain, even in base form, being able to momentarily swap hands with him. So Naruto does show a great amount of relativity to Pain even in Sage Mode. Now, this sick Itachi, on the other hand, is a little harder to use just because he's on the brink of blindness, as well as being affected by severe illness. He's in a very peculiar situation, as his main asset at this point is his pure hacks. Now, let's not get it twisted. He's still shown to have superiority to characters like Kisame in the Canon Storm game Naruto Generations, the second he activates his Mangekyo, as well as being able to one-shot Orochimaru's 8-headed serpent jutsu, which surpasses Orochimaru himself. The problem is, right, he just doesn't display those radical feats that his Edo Tensei counterpart does in the war. So in terms of like conventional feats, he's a little like lacking almost. It's just a very weird predicament to be in. We also have showings from Itachi in part 1 that show him having some stamina issues with his Mangekyo Sharingan. Now we can actually see this most prominently displayed in terms of his Mangekyo usage when we see him use Tsukuyomi twice, Amaterasu once, and Exploding Shadow Clone in the Water Fang Bullet Jutsu, leaving Itachi extremely fatigued after all that. With this in mind, it gives off this idea that Itachi is far more formidable in his Akatsuki days, more likely due to his hacks rather than his raw abilities, as he's degrading more and more as the years go by, which makes it really hard to pinpoint his prime state in the Akatsuki days, which is why that's its own like separate category. Now, how would this matchup go? Well, it's pretty clear that Itachi is somewhat hard to place due to his complete illness. We could possibly assert he'd still be above the Sannin tier, but there'd be nothing to suggest that Obito wouldn't also be above that tier, especially when we consider he's more of a rival to Hokage Minato, and especially when we consider the Kage are somewhat relative to one another with the Raikage and Tsunade. Especially if you think they're like pseudo rivals or, you know, rival each other to some extent. That's obviously your own scaling and your own take, but just kind of supporting that. However, again, it just doesn't look in Itachi's favor for him in this sick, weakened state. A lot of people actually bring up the feat of him placing the Amaterasu trap in Sasuke, and that Amaterasu trap, quote unquote, blitzing Obito. Now, this is an interesting feat because there's a lot of, interpretation arguments for it. I've heard this argument a couple times, and essentially the scene plays out of Sasuke using the Amaterasu trap Itachi had placed on him, and essentially Amaterasu blitzes Obito, like catching him off guard, in which case Obito starts screaming, and we see off screen something happens and he comes back totally fine. So there's a couple things we need to look at when looking at this kind of feat. So for starters, we know for a fact that Obito did use Kamui for this feat, so that's not too questionable. This is confirmed by the data book. It's backed up there. To kind of debunk any Izanagi interpretation, because I've heard that argument thrown around. Some people try and argue the fact that the Amaterasu actually sticks to him. That's a weird argument. I don't like that one. It's kind of arguing against the interpretation of the data book. When looking at two different interpretations, it'd be more likely to go with the data book one. But going off of that as well, it actually seems like Obito notices the Amaterasu right as it hits him. And the interesting thing is, right, if he does Kamui out of it, why is he doing this act of screaming and stuff like that? Well, I make the argument it's kind of similar to how he was just acting before in the Akatsuki, in terms of being a complete fool and dunce. He's very prone to be actor-ish, he'll change his personality when the situation suits him. I believe this is for the sake of concealing his power, which is something he takes great care in making sure nobody knows about, which we do know nobody in the Akatsuki even knows about his power. So you can make the argument he's simply acting like it's working in order to lure Sasuke into a false sense of security, which is somewhat backed up by the fact that Sasuke later on kind of thinks Amaterasu would actually be able to affect and defeat Obito. So there is the argument that he's simply bullshitting or just acting out to really just kind of lure Sasuke in, which is a fair argument. Also, as far as the Amaterasu feat itself, there's also the argument if it scales to Itachi's combat speed, if it's as fast as his combat speed, if it's faster, if it's slower, which is its own discussion in and of itself. Specifically with the feat of Obito, it almost wouldn't matter because Sasuke's eye is actually the one looking at Obito. It's not Itachi. And we kind of know Itachi's eyes are horrible at this point, to the point where his Amaterasu could barely even catch Sasuke, simply because he could barely perceive Sasuke. He's almost like a silhouette to Itachi, a very blurred out silhouette. So he doesn't have any precision with his Amaterasu. He's unable to really hit anything. So even if you make the argument, right, let's say I really give Itachi the benefit of the doubt in this second state and really say that his Amaterasu is far faster than him and Obito, which it wouldn't be at this point. There's the argument of if he would even be able to see Obito and perceive him correctly enough to even hit him. So the whole feat with Obito getting hit by the Amaterasu doesn't transfer well, especially because it's Sasuke's eye actually looking into Obito and not Itachi's, which is just blurred out to the point where he's pretty much blind. So when talking about Kamui, it's rather interesting because we know Obito's actually able to activate it unconsciously. It's not something he really has to think about. Even his base Sharingan, so it's not even he gives it away with his Mangekyo as if he's gonna do it. He never really has to activate it. But pretty much the way it works is that you basically have to blitz Obito when he actually materializes to go attack. That was the whole point of Minato versus Obito. It was pretty much Minato had to blitz Obito whenever he materialized to attack, which is actually how Minato won that fight with his combination of Flying Raijin. So pretty much Itachi's win condition here is to wait for Obito to attack, and then you would have to argue Itachi would be somewhat fast enough to actually pierce Obito with the Totsuka blade, or maybe slit his throat with kunai if you want to argue his combat speed is on some godly level. But obviously that's a lot easier said than done, as Obito could actually just remain intangible while Itachi fires off techniques and wastes his stamina away. As for him specifically, we know the Mangekyo is just a detriment to his stamina, and even more so you could see this with MS Sasuke in the 5 Kage Summit. MS Sasuke is a complete juggernaut with a fresh Mangekyo Sharingan, but even he is just get completely decimated in terms of his stamina by the Mangekyo. He's just continuously taking hits. It's very taxing on him. You see him many times throughout the fight coughing up blood and actually taking a moment to rest. He even notes versus May, every cell in his body is just in complete agony. So it's definitely a lot harder for the Itachi side, as Obito would really just have to wait for Itachi to throw out moves. And a lot of Itachi's moves don't even affect Obito during Kamui, if arguably none of them. What about Genjutsu? Well, this should be pretty self-explanatory, but Tsukuyomi shouldn't really be anything to Obito, especially we know if Sasuke can break through it, and pretty much Obito having superior visual prowess to Sasuke, and arguably Itachi, as the databook describes in part 2 that nobody except Madara or Obito at the time can actually control the Nine Tails, even in the alive. So you can make the argument that this Itachi that's sick and weakened in the Akatsuki at the time of part 2 doesn't even have enough power to actually control the Nine Tails. In which case, like, Obito has just showcased this as a feat and in lore, so that shouldn't be too questionable either in terms of that. There's pretty much nothing to suggest that he shouldn't be able to break out of the Tsukiyomi. Like, he just has far better feats in terms of Genjutsu, and if somebody with a far inferior Genjutsu like Resistance and Sharingan can break out of it, like, there's no reason Obito can't. Like, I don't think this is too much of a point of contention. Now, probably Itachi's best shot at actually beating Obito, in my opinion, is the Totsuka Blade. Surprise, surprise. Because if it actually does hit Obito when Obito materializes, that actually is a GG. There's nothing you can do with that. And there's a couple of ways you could even argue it. For example, like how it would interact with his Kamui. If he hits Obito's Kamui, does it actually suck Obito in? Or does it not work? The way I interpret it is because of Obito transporting his body part and chakra, which is noted to disappear when Obito swaps to another dimension. There's nothing really for the Totsuka Blade to really grab onto. So in my opinion, it wouldn't work just because we've seen his chakra and body disappear with no remnants left. Now, that is only if Kamui is active. If Obito materializes again, it's the GG. There's also the argument of Itachi's stats being so low at this point that he actually might not even be able to hit Obito with the Totsuka Blade. And if Obito actually does even grab Itachi, it's kind of a GG. Even Minato thinks it's a GG if, like, he even gets touched by Obito. So there's just really nothing to suggest that, like, Itachi at this point would be able to take down this Obito, as Obito's somewhat implied to be more of a rival to much more prime Itachi, which we'll get into momentarily. Itachi actually has the hacks to take down Obito. It's more so that his raw stats are lacking in this category, whereas Obito has the raw stats and the hacks to just kind of take it at this point. So we're going to move off this point, but I don't think there will be too much contention with that. It's just this sick Itachi really just doesn't have too much. So he obviously is getting swamped by this Obito. I would argue like low to mid diff, because he's only really talked about to be threatening to Obito with prep time. So it's just really, there's just nothing really you could say about it. The IQ thing also wouldn't really be too relevant, as his just stats are so bad at this point that, like, the argument of if he could figure out Obito's ability isn't as relevant about it. Now, a side point for Itachi, you know, just being able to figure out Obito's abilities. We actually do know from Naruto Road to Ninja, the movie that Kishimoto worked on, in which Obito creates a parallel universe in which it's implied these characters have the same strength as their canonical counterparts. It's just kind of seen with, like, for example, right, you could look in the movie and, like, Menma's Nine Tails is able to combat Naruto's Nine Tails evenly, so they're about the same strength. Actually, they're exactly the same strength, so it's kind of these implications. But essentially, right, the Itachi of that world actually does have some confidence in being able to affect Obito, even though Obito's in this translucent form, and even notes this, like, he has ways to deal with Obito. So it's actually kind of interesting on that front as well. He actually does display some confidence there, which would only help the Itachi argument in terms of, like, him figuring out Obito's abilities relatively quickly, although we do know in the canon side he actually has seen Obito, like, teleport and such. So up in the air again, but just a side note on that. I'm essentially going to be moving on to a live Itachi with his, like, Edo and, like, more prime feats, because that's what Obito's more comparable to. So essentially Orange Mask is going to be put over, like, the sick ailed Itachi, which I don't think there's going to be too much contention, but the Amaterasu point is the main one I've heard brought up in that Itachi's defense, so I just really wanted to address that. But now moving on to, like, the Itachi Shinen novel. Essentially, the line everybody brings up with the Itachi Shinen novel is that pretty much pre-Massacre Itachi, which would actually be weaker than post-Massacre Itachi, because he would have great mental strife in terms of killing his whole clan. His eyes would get powered up exponentially, but unquantifiably so. But he logically would just get amped from having this great emotional turmoil and trauma from killing his clan, which is a point definitely to consider here. But essentially, before the massacre, he has this discussion with Obito in which they kind of throw words back and forth, in which the thing people quote the most is, "Silence enveloped them. There was no bloodlust in either of their auras. They were exchanging dangerous words, but they acknowledged each other as opponents." Now, this is very loose in terms of being able to argue it. A lot of people just simply slice it up to them being relative to one another, but being an opponent to somebody doesn't inherently mean that you're, like, relative to them. For example, you could be an opponent to somebody far weaker than you. Even in the War Arc, for example, like White Mask, Obito thinks of, like, Shikamaru as an opponent, but obviously, like, Shikamaru doesn't, like, fully scale to that Obito. So there's certain problems with the fact that, like, the word opponent is used. let's actually look at the definition of an opponent to kind of get like a full, kind of more objective gaze on this. Opponent, someone who competes against or fights in a contest, game, or argument. And then you could also make the argument of a rival or adversary. So it's not inherently rival-esque. You could make that argument, but the implication here is that they both just think of each other as somebody they're going to have to fight. Now, whether or not you want to argue their confidence in being able to fight each other, that's something, another discussion entirely. But this is kind of supported by the statement right before, in which Itachi notes, it's not a matter of whether or not I will kill you. He had already taken a step down a road that would not allow him to turn back. He did not hesitate. So it's almost like inevitability that they're going to have to fight. So because of that, they become opponents. And again, opponents is so loose. Like, an opponent could be somebody who's trying to foil your plans. It could also be that rival interpretation. I just want to make note that this whole like novel, like, argument is just very loose in general and can be argued a couple different ways. I'm just of the opinion that opponent doesn't inherently mean a rival to. An opponent can be just somebody you are going to face. Now, what's interesting is, like, let's say they are, right? Let's say they are rivaling each other. Then obviously that would just kind of support the interpretation that Obito would just kind of be more comparable to like a more prime version of Itachi. But let's say you give a live Itachi his Edo Tensei feats, in which he just shows extraordinary finesse. I'm going to get into the Edo Tensei side a little bit later, but just kind of like give an abridged version of it. He's able to compete with Base B, KCM Naruto, Sage Kabuto, and even rival a suppressed EMS Sasuke, while Itachi himself is suppressed, which I'll also get into. So essentially he displays these radical feats. Now, in part, this is due to the fact that he basically has an Eternal Mangekyo Sharingan as an Edo Tensei. So the feats he displays there wouldn't 100% translate to like a bloodlusted encounter with Obito specifically, and I'm going to get into why. So we do know for a fact that Itachi does not know all of Obito's abilities. You can definitely make the argument he would figure them out mid-fight, which I also think would be the case, because he's just shown godly intelligence feats like all over the board. It's just he's shown like the ability to just decipher jutsu very quickly. So I don't doubt the fact that he could figure out Obito's ability, especially if someone like Minato could, who I think Itachi is comparable to in intelligence or greater than. The issue is, right, how much of Itachi's chakra does he have to expend in order to figure this out? And what I mean by this is Itachi in a more alive prime state in part 1 is shown after throwing out 3 or 4 Mangekyo techniques. I believe it's the water fang bullet and like an exploding clone. Actually has to rest his eyes for the day. He's pretty much fatigued himself. So it's very interesting because it kind of gets into the point, like, how many Mangekyo techniques does Itachi have to throw out in order to actually decipher Obito's abilities, and how long would he last in those kind of battles, because he's just shown to be very drained very quickly along with the MS drawbacks. So pretty much when he starts throwing out Mangekyo techniques, he's already going to start degrading mid-battle. So it's kind of a question of how quickly he could figure it out and how degraded he becomes throughout the fight, whether that be his vision, chakra supply, or Mangekyo backlash, all of which Obito could pretty much act on. So it kind of goes into this like contentious like headcanon category, in which I'm going to kind of leave that up to the viewer. I don't think there's an objective way to say like how fast Obito would like get his abilities figured out by Itachi. I don't think we can really say that. I think it's more of a matter of how quickly you think that is the case. I just want to note that alive Itachi with Edo's feats struggles a lot more than just simply Edo Itachi, who has a lot more of a confident time taking on this orange mask Obito. So I kind of gets into my point where like alive prime like Edo feats Itachi versus orange mask Obito, Itachi has a much better case than his other part. As far as how the fight would go, it really depends on how quickly you think he could take Obito down. But if you really get Itachi and upscale him to a lot of these stronger characters, you can probably make a very good case that he would be able to just kind of dismantle Obito. Although a speed blitz argument is very hard to say, because we do know Kamui is unconscious, and we actually know like the materialization part is actually what he's consciously doing, and that's what actually Itachi has to catch. But then again, if Obito catches Itachi first, it's kind of game over if he throws him in his dimension, and even Minato kind of notes this. So it's really just kind of like up in the air, like really like how that fight would go. But generally, here's a way I'll put it for like to give a like more concise and objective answer. Alive Itachi with Edo feats does have better feats and scaling, so because of that, you could make a better argument for him beating Orange Mask Obito. But his alive state does have many drawbacks, so there is the argument that Orange Mask could take it off that, depending on how you interpret that. I don't think there's like a super objective measure to say like how it would go. But if you think like Speed Blitz, that's kind of like up in the air as well because of Kamui again. So think what you want on that, but Itachi does display better feats. So I would personally side with an alive Itachi with his prime feats on this side. Maybe his stamina could like present issues. Again, viewer interpretation. So alive Itachi has some contention with like how his stamina and how his eyes and how like his MS degrades over time. Really don't want to get too much into that because I already covered it a lot. But Edo Itachi pretty much removes all these drawbacks. In which case Edo Itachi should stand a far better chance versus Obito. I'm gonna get into their hacks and how they could possibly interact later on. But just note that this Edo Itachi pretty much has no drawbacks that alive Itachi does. He has way higher like possibilities of scaling. And what I mean by like possibilities of scaling, he's more comparable to a lot stronger characters who White Mask Obito himself faces in the form of like, I guess EMS Sasuke, who's also comparable to like a more stabilized KCM Naruto. So this shouldn't be too questionable in terms of like Edo Itachi versus Orange Mask. However, White Mask Obito versus Edo Itachi is a far more, contentious argument because they both display very similar feats. Let's talk about it. So the interesting thing about White Mask Obito, so for starters, if you give him all the Bijou, he's getting, Itachi's getting wiped. That's not questionable. And the reason for that is that Itachi just doesn't have the raw power to actually like kind of take down the Bijou. You could maybe argue like his, they don't have like the AP to break his Susanoo. That's also somewhat contentious, especially where you scale Itachi's like Susanoo in terms of AP. So that's its own argument, but he's not like a fighter like Pain, in which like Pain is actually able to like Shinra Tensei Gamabuta and the other like Sage Toads from Mount Moyoboku. So he actually lacks that raw power to like blow them away. And especially if you consider Obito's fighting alongside them, that's a wipe. So I don't think that's too contentious, especially with those same Edo Tensei fighters being able to combat Killer Bee and Naruto relatively well. They're actually on the like better receiving end of it. They're actually able to press them very hard and very confidently. So that shouldn't be too questionable for anybody. But let's just move on to like White Mask himself versus Itachi. A lot of people for the Itachi side go off EMS Sasuke. I personally don't like this route. I don't think he fully scales to EMS Sasuke, and let me kind of explain why this is the case. So the issue with Itachi scaling EMS Sasuke is during this encounter, him and Sasuke are both suppressed. So the idea is, right, you can't really like pick at the semantics of that fight because they're both suppressed, because of the fact that one, Itachi's an Edo Tensei, so he can fight more recklessly, but also him and Sasuke are like withholding all, like their abilities and power. For example, right, you don't see Itachi using like the Totsuka blade or Yadamir, or Sasuke using his like flame control, both of which could easily actually like one-shot Kabuto. He doesn't really have a big answer for that. Even the raw heat from Amaterasu was like returning the cave to its natural form. So it's really shown that they're just both in a suppressed state. And on top of this, we actually know that Itachi, after seeing this suppressed Sasuke, does recognize him as his complete equal. Now, you could make an argument of like philosophically or ideologically to like kind of like talk the truth, like equal standing. But this also could be interpreted as like equal standing as a shinobi as well. But then equal standing as a shinobi is very vague. Like Kakashi thinks base Naruto is like relative enough to fight alongside him. So there's a lot of arguments that could be made of this as well. But pretty much Itachi's convinced after seeing Sasuke suppressed with his EMS abilities that he isn't equal to him or relative enough to his actual strength. And this is the data book speaking, not Itachi simply speaking in a suppressed state. So very interesting on that point. So that's kind of another reason like it's kind of harder for the Itachi and EMS Sasuke. But let's say you do get Itachi and EMS Sasuke kind of relative, they're rivals, you put them at the same strength. The problem is as well with that Sasuke actually gets stronger after that fight. It's heavily implied he gets somewhat of a hatred amp as he notes his hatred has grown right after meeting Itachi. Now, what's interesting is we know like the Sharingan's directly linked to people's emotions. We actually know even in the 5 Kage Summit, Sasuke's hatred was amping his strength exponentially. There'd be no reason to suggest it wouldn't be the same case with his eternal Mangekyo Sharingan. So there also is the argument of like Sasuke actually getting stronger after this fight as well, which is kind of another reason I'm not the biggest on using it for Itachi. There also is the argument of like that KCM Naruto that EMS Sasuke fights alongside. Like, how strong is that KCM Naruto? How much stronger is he than the other KCM forms shown before? Does he even get stronger, or is that just after the initial KCM 2? A lot of questions and a lot of unquantifiable measures. So really, in my opinion, White Mask Obito has a lot more solid scaling, just due to the fact that he's confidently taking on like KCM 1, KCM 2, more stabilized KCM 1, and arguably more stabilized KCM 2. So he just shown like better, feats in that, along with the Rinnegan abilities, which is something that not a lot of people bring up. His Rinnegan abilities are crazy when stacked onto his like Kamui. Like he kind of had these one shots before, but then there's the argument of like when he starts stacking his Rinnegan abilities onto these one shots, it really gets crazy. So he's just a lot more hacksy at this point as well. He just kind of has this crazy increase in power, and he's never really shown being pressured either by any of these fighters. I'm not saying Itachi ever was pressured either, but I'm simply making the note that Obito is able to combat stronger versions of fighters that Itachi had fight, and more of them. So he just kind of displays this like better showings in terms of like a combatant. So that's also an interesting point. However, I do think a lot of this is kind of up to your interpretation on some different fights and how Itachi exactly stacks up. Same thing with Obito. It's just my opinion that Obito would stack up to these higher tiers of characters with more solid showings, whereas Itachi's showings could be argued because of the context those fights actually take place under. The more I thought about this little section, the more I just kind of was like, man, Obito's not stoppable, man. And the reason is, right, like when you consider the fact that he's completely pressuring and confidently handling a much stronger KCM Naruto. And we know like Naruto actually got stronger after linking up with Kurama. You can even see this with his mini Bijou bomb. He blows himself out of his cloak before even attempting to create the jutsu, whereas now he can throw it out very freely and very casually. It's a very solid technique for him. And even Naruto himself actually notes that Obito is just way too strong in general, and he's having a lot of trouble actually just getting in on Obito. And we see this as Wara, Kakashi, and Guy are both also helping out, along with B assisting in the back too. So this White Mask Obito is actually replicating, a feat Itachi actually has done. And it's arguably more impressive, as KCM2 Naruto is also seen combating him as well. Now, how much stronger Naruto gets after this point is rather unquantifiable. So I don't really like to use that argument because there's no real measure of that. So to say like EMS Sasuke stacks up against the stronger KCM Naruto, for one, that EMS Sasuke is arguably stronger than the one that Itachi fought with, along with the fact that even if you argue the KCM Naruto Sasuke fought alongside with was stronger, it's rather unquantifiable. So it's really a mute and hard point to use. But moving past this, right, if we actually consider the fact that White Mask Obito actually has superior feats, his arsenal is just godly at this point. He has access to Kamui plus the Rinnegan abilities, which he actually doesn't really show fatigue at all when spamming Kamui or anything like that. It makes for a way easier time in dealing with Itachi. For example, let's say he starts absorbing any attacks Itachi throws at him, then any of Itachi's like attacks become his own chakra, fueling him for the battle, so there's nothing really there. Soul Snatch is also like even more viable than the Kamui Snatch, or BFR I should say. There's also the argument of Obito actually summoning the Geto Mazo to fight alongside with him against Itachi, which if he kind of does that, it's kind of over as well. Just imagine for a second, let's just pause the video. Imagine Obito and the Geto Mazo taking on Itachi together. That's crazy. That's just insane enough to think about. On top of this, he's just showcased such prominent jutsu potency as well. For example, you can just see his fire style be just as potent as Madara's and the Jubi's attacks, with his fire style bomb blast dance actually requiring Naruto to go into his KCM2 just to even deflect it. It's just quite insane what Obito has at this point. And for example, right, if you really want to get to the nit and gritty of how his feats are more impressive, you can look at Sasuke's Amaterasu burning down the Eight Tails, right? And impressive, AP feat, right? Like it's oh man, like it's burning down the 8 tails. Here comes Obito with like a low chakra barrier, just replicating the same feat like casually. He's able to completely block out a tailed beast and burn his hand like completely. So it's just like he just has his like own arsenal. And obviously Itachi's Amaterasu AP could be vastly different than Sasuke's. It could be far superior or inferior, again depending on your interpretation of that. But the point stands that like Obito just replicates all these feats very, very casually. He's just shown replicating Itachi's feats just much better as well. It's just very hard for the Itachi side. In my opinion, there's just certain presuppositions I just don't agree with, as well as the fact there's many factors that people just kind of ignore to like get Itachi as high as possible, when I don't think they're necessarily the case. I do think White Mask Obito would take down Itachi, even in his Edo Tensei state. Again, there actually is the possibility he could take down Obito with his hacks, especially if you kind of go with the presuppositions that I disagreed with. You could definitely possibly get him higher, although I think there's actually quite a bit of issues with that linear scaling. Now, actual big win con for Itachi I actually don't see discussed enough is Izanami, right? If Edo Itachi actually is in the battle long enough and he actually does like start getting the Izanami going, he can totally get Obito under control with that. As Obito was denying his true self, he was under the facade that he was just another Madara clone at this point. He was basically just adopting Madara's philosophy and way of talking and Madara's identity as a whole, and he really forgot who he actually was, which was Obito Uchiha. So if Itachi actually does get Izanami going, that's definitely a valid win condition for him, as well as the fact that if he could possibly make Obito expend enough chakra, but we've never really seen the upper limits of Obito's like chakra threshold. You could make the argument that he has like crazy chakra reserves to even be like controlling all the tailed beasts or like pretty much combating all these characters, or that Kamui just takes a ridiculously low amount of chakra. Either or really works, but he's just shown such prominent feats that it just doesn't really work for me in the Itachi sense. Like when you stack on the fact that Obito is kind of contentious with Itachi before with just Kamui, you stack on the Rinnegan abilities, the Rinnegan summons, all Itachi really has is like what he had before, like Totsuka Blade, because we know his other two main options wouldn't really work against Obito. So most of his hacks actually do get negged by Obito, whereas pretty much most of Obito's like hacks can go through Itachi. And if you're gonna make the argument like the Yaramir, Obito would simply like phase through that as well. So it's not like that's really relevant. Maybe in the case of, actually not maybe, definitely in the case of like his fire style or any ninjutsu like that. But then again, like Obito's always been the type of fighter who simply just grab somebody and GG. He's never been one for like long confrontations too. So it's not like this would be a very drawn out battle as well. As not only would Itachi have to try and decipher Obito's Kamui, but he would also have to deal with the Rinnegan abilities on top of it. It's just very hard. I just don't see it happening, especially with the idea that Obito has a lot more solid scaling in general in his White Mask form, whereas Itachi just kind of has these presuppositions you have to accept. And this honestly works better in Obito's favor, especially if you think like characters like Minato are like faster than like Tobirama, for example, as even Tobirama notes like Minato has better body flicker than him and flying Raijin. So like, do you think like Minato and base has like better feats than Tobirama and can like bounce off those feats? Like there's all these crazy scalings for Minato too. So it's just a lot more confident, a lot more wiggle room for him just to be argued to win, whereas you kind of have to like super linearly scale Itachi up and then just argue Totsuka Blade when Obito materializes. So yeah, it's just not as solid for Itachi in my opinion. So that being said, that's the video. Let me know if you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you guys want to see more of this kind of stuff. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Bye bye.